The first thing they noticed was the absence of birds, a hush so absolute it seemed to press against the eardrums like water at the bottom of a well. In the last week of October 1794, when the ridges of western Virginia were already brittle with frost, the morning sky over Narrow Ridge stood empty even of scavenger crows, as though every winged creature had agreed, in some silent parliament older than man, to vacate the air above the cove. The second thing was the smell, not the honest reek of leaf mold or wood smoke, but something sweeter, denser, reminiscent of scalded milk mixed with the coppery tang that hangs in a butcher's shed after the pigs have been bled. It clung to the inside of the nostrils, coated the tongue, followed the 5 families who lived along the trace all the way into their dreams. Children woke crying, unable to say why. Dogs crawled beneath floorboards and refused to come out even when the cast-iron skillet was rattled with bacon grease. The third thing was the voice that rose from the cabin of Ephraim Hark, the self-appointed prayer-monger, at the stroke of 3 every morning, neither chant nor song, but a low, deliberate recitation delivered in a tongue no one could name, a cadence that seemed to travel the bone before it reached the ear. By the time the moon had waned to a sliver, the cove had agreed, without a vote or even a spoken word, to avoid the Hark clearing after dusk, yet every soul found himself drawn to the window at the same dark hour, standing breathless in coarse linen nightshirts, feet numbing against the plank floor, listening to that voice crawl down the chimney and settle like soot in the lungs. They told themselves it was only religion taken too far, the way a man alone will sometimes overseason his stew, but the pulse in their throats knew better. Something had been summoned, or perhaps something long-tethered had been cut loose. Either way, the ridge now breathed with a second set of lungs, and the sound they heard was its slow, experimental exhale. The settlement, if 12 cabins, a corn mill, and a meeting house leaning westward like a drunkard can be called a settlement, lay cupped between 2 arms of the Blue Ridge, reachable only by a trace so narrow that riders had to turn sideways in the saddle to keep their knees from scraping rock. The year 1794 had brought a late drought, creeks shrank to ribbons, cornstalks snapped in the fields like dry bones, and the usual autumn sound of axes was muted because no one had the heart to swing them. The war tax of the previous spring had taken the last good horse, and the whiskey excise had taken the rest, so men walked the ridge with shoulders hunched as though carrying invisible yokes. They were descendants of Ulster Scots who had come down the valley 50 years earlier, carrying only a psalter, a rifle, and a habit of endurance that looked, from the outside, like stupidity. Their cabins were built of chestnut logs chinked with red clay, smoke issued from the chimneys in thin, apologetic threads. They spoke a dialect full of obsolete thee and thou, pronounced oil as vile, and still believed that a clock stopped at the hour of a death should never be restarted. In such a place, custom was bone and sinew. To break it was to risk something worse than ridicule, for ridicule could be borne, whereas the unnamed alternative, what their grandmothers called the outer dark, could not. Ephraim Hark arrived in the cove during the last week of September, riding a mule so bony that its ribs looked like the bars of a cage in which the animal had attempted, and failed, to imprison itself. He wore black broadcloth despite the heat, and a hat whose brim had been eaten away, it seemed, by acid rain. His eyes were the color of river water in winter, and when he dismounted, the mule did not wander off to crop grass but stood tethered to its own stillness, ears swiveling as though receiving distant instructions. Hark claimed to have come from north of the Kanawha, spoke little, and accepted hospitality in the form of corn pone and buttermilk without thanks. Yet the next morning he appeared at the meeting house before the elders, produced a calf-bound Bible printed in Edinburgh in 1721. And announced that the congregation stood in need of prayers mongered for them, lest the land itself fall. No one had used the word mongered in that fashion before, but they understood him well enough. He offered to intercede, for no fee, against whatever was gnawing at the edges of their nights. In a season when cash money had all but vanished, free intercession sounded like mercy. They allowed him to occupy the disused cabin at the head of the trace, the one whose previous owner had been carried out feet first after coughing his lungs into a red bandana. The door had warped on its leather hinges. Hark straightened it with a stone and a borrowed auger, hung a horseshoe upside down above the jamb, and began, that very evening, to pray. The Ridge had known revivals before, rough-hewn affairs where preaching lasted until tongues bled and penitents rolled on the ground like shot deer. But Hark's devotions were different. He did not preach, he petitioned. He spoke neither to the congregation nor to God in the familiar tones of petition, but to something else, something he addressed in the collective plural, as though it were a senate of shadows. He stood in the yard beneath a white oak whose leaves had turned the color of spoiled liver, head thrown back, arms dangling so loosely that the fingertips brushed the ground, and from his mouth issued a stream of syllables that seemed to have been chipped from the air itself, hard consonants followed by long vowels that made the hearer's teeth ache. Afterward, the ground beneath his feet was stamped smooth as if by a herd, though no hoof or boot had touched it. Children who crept close swore they saw the oak leaves turn themselves inside out, revealing a pale undersurface veined like the inside of a wrist. And though no one admitted to understanding the language, each listener came away convinced that his own most secret crime had been named, quietly, in the middle of the third stanza. They returned to their cabins shaken, not with the wholesome terror of judgment, but with the unholy relief of collusion. By the second week, the cove had begun to divide along invisible seams. Some households, mostly the young couples who still believed the world could be improved, took to leaving before dawn for the distant fields, returning only after dark, unwilling to risk meeting Hark on the trace. Others, older, childless, or simply tired, drifted toward the prayer yard each evening as if towed by a rope they could neither see nor drop. They stood at the edge of the lamplight, hats in hand, saying nothing, waiting for the voice to name them. One night Elias McTavish, whose wife had died of milk sickness the previous spring, stepped forward when the praying ended and asked, in a voice dry as dead leaves, whether remission might be purchased for a man who had once struck his daughter so hard she lost the hearing in one ear. Hark regarded him without visible pity, then extended a hand marked with a scar that ran from thumb to wrist like a closed, secret mouth. McTavish took it. No words were exchanged, yet the next morning McTavish walked to the bluff above Sinking Creek and hung himself with a plough line, leaving his boots side by side on the precipice as though he expected to return barefoot. When they cut him down, the scar had appeared on his own hand, a perfect mirror of Hark's, flesh swollen around it like soil around a buried stone. No one spoke of it openly, but attendance at the prayer yard doubled. Part 2. October wore on, and the drought deepened its grip until the soil cracked open in polygons wide enough to swallow a child's foot. Wells that had never failed receded, revealing layers of sediment the color of dried blood. The corn crop, already stunted, was devoured not by crows but by field mice that marched in dense columns at twilight, their eyes shining with a dull, collective intelligence. They did not scatter when shot, they simply absorbed the loss and continued. Mothers kept infants inside, fearing the mice more than wolves, for wolves at least announced themselves. In the meeting house, the elders debated whether to send for a circuit rider, but the trace was said to be watched. And no rider had passed since Hark's arrival. Besides, the Prayer-Monger had promised protection, and to revoke that bargain while the land itself seemed to be contracting felt like unfastening the only remaining button on a coat in a blizzard. So they stayed, and they listened, and the voice grew richer, as though gorged on the silence it created. Ephraim Hark kept his own counsel. He accepted no food after sundown, drew water only from the spring that emerged beneath a laurel thicket no one else dared use, and was seen once washing his hands in the runoff of the graveyard, though the ground there was frozen hard as iron. The cabin that had once smelled of mildew and old pipe smoke now carried the same sweetness that drifted over the cove at night, only condensed, as though someone had boiled the air down to a syrup. Visitors, those few who still risked the curiosity, reported that the single window was covered with a greased parchment so thick that daylight entered like a convict, bent and grey. Inside, the walls were lined with pages torn from Bibles and almanacs, each sheet inscribed with a single column of the same unknown characters Hark spoke aloud. The ink looked brown, flaking at the edges, and gave off the faint suggestion of iron. A visitor who touched one page with a tentative fingertip found the print still wet, and when he withdrew his hand, the whirl of his fingerprint remained behind, transferred to the paper as though the wall had begun to catalogue those who entered. He fled, but for days afterward tasted rust at the back of his mouth, and when he woke the next morning, the scar of that print had darkened on his own skin, a reverse stigma that no pumice could scour away. The McTavish suicide should have been the cove's gravest trespass, but it was merely prelude. 3 nights later, the 8-year-old twins of the widow Ari were found asleep in the cornfield, laid out head-to-head in a perfect circle of flattened stalks. Their lips were cracked as if from thirst, yet their throats were sticky with honey that smelled faintly of magnolia. They could not remember how they had left their straw pallet, nor why their nightgowns were damp with dew when no dew had fallen in weeks. The widow, frantic, carried them to Hark, who received her on the threshold but did not invite her in. He studied the children without touching them, then pronounced that the ledger had been opened early for them, but might yet be closed if the community paid what it owed. When asked what was owed, he replied only, "What you prize above breath itself," and shut the door. That night, every bee in the cove swarmed the widow's cabin, cramming themselves into the chinks between logs until the walls appeared to vibrate. At dawn they were gone, leaving behind enough wax to make 3 candles, each stamped with the same reversed fingerprint that had appeared on the visitor's hand. The widow fled with her twins to her brother's farm over the mountain, but the mountain took her, a rockslide, unheard of in those parts, erased the trace for half a mile, and no sign of her wagon was ever found. Seasons in the mountains are less a wheel than a steep staircase. Once the top step is reached, the plunge comes fast. The first frost arrived the morning after the widow's disappearance, and with it a fog that did not lift for 6 days. It clung to the ground like cotton soaked in ice water, muffling hoofbeats and turning every tree into a drowned corpse. Inside the fog, direction lost meaning. Men walked 100 yards to chop wood and found themselves at the threshold of their own cabins, axes gone, hands blistered as if they had swung all day at nothing. The prayer yard, however, remained clear, a column of cold air in which Hark's voice rose unchecked. Those who attended claimed they could see their own words escaping their mouths as pale worms of vapor that drifted toward the prayer-monger and were inhaled with the next breath. They stood transfixed while their memories were thus siphoned, and when they returned home, they could not recall what hymns they had sung as children, what their dead mothers had called them, whether the scar on a spouse's hand had always been there. The fog did not dissipate. It retreated each noon to the laurel thicket, where it lay like a beast digesting its nightly meal. And still the voice prayed on, cataloguing, inventorying, preparing. Part 3. November opened with a moon the color of tarnished pewter, low enough to snag on the blackened tips of fir trees. The cove had begun to starve in earnest. The last hog was slaughtered in secret, its bones buried beneath the manure pile to keep them from Hark, who was said to read the future in marrow. Cornmeal was stretched with sawdust, mothers boiled shoe leather to make a broth that would quiet children for a few merciful hours. Yet every dawn, a single cake of fresh yellow bread appeared on the prayer-monger's window sill, steam curling in the shape of that same reversed fingerprint. No one admitted to baking it. The bread smelled of saffron and rot, and the dog that wolfed down a discarded crust was found contorted into a hoop so tight that its spine had snapped like green kindling. Hunger, however, is a more persuasive preacher than conscience. When the dog's carcass vanished overnight, whispers spread that the bread had been offered back to them, transformed. A few crept to the clearing and tasted crumbs scraped from the sill. They described a flavor that began as honey, passed through the metallic sting of a struck flint, and ended as the exact taste of their own tongue the instant before a lie is uttered. The disappearance of the preacher's own mule ought to have been occasion for rejoicing, proof that even Ephraim Hark was subject to ordinary misfortune. Instead, it deepened the chill. The animal had been tethered inside a stall built of hickory rails. The door was still latched, the hay untouched, yet the mule was gone, leaving behind only a single long ear laid flat on the ground like a withered leaf. The ear was still warm when discovered, and the blood that seeped from its base formed a perfect circle on the packed dirt, the same diameter as the flattened cornstalk ring where the twins had been found. Hark said nothing. He carried the ear to the prayer yard, placed it atop the white oak stump, and covered it with a pewter plate. That night the voice rose higher, abandoning the low register of supplication for a keening, almost feminine register that scraped against the inner rim of the skull. Words became audible, though still foreign, and embedded within them were fragments of English pronounced backward, Lars for shall, Evig for give. Listeners caught their own names reversed, spoken not to them but through them, as though their identities were being sewn into the lining of a garment they would thereafter be required to wear skin-side in. What had been private dread now metastasized into communal hallucination. Widower Jedediah Crone, a man once famous for sleeping through thunder, woke the household by firing his rifle into the darkness, swearing he saw his dead wife standing at the foot of the bed combing her hair with the mule's severed ear. The ball lodged in the ceiling beam. When pried out the next morning, it had been transmuted into a clot of reddish wax that smelled of magnolia and gunpowder. Crone's daughter, 17 and betrothed to a boy from the next cove, began to speak in the same reversed English, calmly informing her father that the dowry has been weighed and found porous. 3 days later she walked into the fog at dawn wearing only her shift. Searchers found the shift hanging from a branch at the fork of the trace, stiff with ice, but no footprints leading away. The boy she was to marry followed her trail into the laurel thicket and emerged at dusk carrying a child's shoe that had belonged to his intended 20 years earlier, down to the scuff on the toe made the day she had first declared her love. He aged visibly in those hours, his hair turned the color of wood ash, and he refused to speak again, even when his mother pressed her palm against his lips to feel for breath. The community, what remained of it, met in the meeting house by candle made from the widow's beeswax. They spoke in whispers, though the fog pressed its face against the shutters like a voyeur. The question before them was not whether Hark must be confronted. Confrontation belonged to a world where right and wrong still carried currency, but how to revoke an invitation already granted. They had no minister. The last had fled to Winchester after dreaming of hands growing from the pulpit to throttle him. They had no law. The county sheriff had died of a fever the previous winter, and the new appointee had never climbed the trace. All they possessed was custom, and custom required that a man who disturbed the peace be laid out of the cove, a euphemism that sounded gentler than the blood it implied. Yet to lay Hark out, they must first lay hands on him, and to touch him felt like touching the very membrane through which the world drew its breath. They resolved instead to starve him out, to bring no more offerings, to withhold even the sight of their faces. A silence was declared. No word would be spoken to the prayer-monger, no loaf left, no ear inclined to his voice. They nailed the declaration to the meeting-house door with the same nail that had once held the mule's ear, though no one could remember removing it. The first night of the silence, every dog within the cove began to dig. They excavated beneath cabins, beneath the corn crib, beneath the meeting house itself, flinging earth until their paws bled. When restrained, they gnawed through hemp rope as though it were grass. By morning, shallow trenches crisscrossed the settlement like the runnels of a giant, palsied plough. At the bottom of each lay a single object, a child's milk tooth, a wedding ring, a fragment of tombstone carved with the initials E.H. The objects were not buried, they were partly grown into the soil, as though the ridge itself had been patiently cultivating them. Hark appeared at dusk, walking the pattern of the trenches, hands folded behind his back, the reversed print on his hand now black as chimney soot. He did not speak, yet the silence vibrated like a bell after the clapper has been stilled. One by one, the families retrieved their relics. One by one, they felt the ridge give beneath them the way ice gives when the current beneath has already decided the hour of its breaking. Part 4. Winter arrived without announcement, a blade slipped between the ribs of the year. The fog froze into needles that hung in the air, refusing to fall. Breath crystallized into tiny mirrors that reflected not the face of the breather but the face of whoever would mourn him. The cove's store of firewood had been depleted by the dogs' excavations. Green limbs hissed in the hearths like serpents, giving more smoke than flame. In the prayer yard, the white oak leaves finally relinquished their grip, but instead of drifting, they rose, circling the stump in a slow, inverse snowfall, spinning faster whenever Hark inhaled. He no longer waited for night, he prayed at dawn, at noon, at the hour when the sun's rim touched the western ridge and bled into it. The voice had become polyphonic. Listeners swore they heard a child's soprano threading beneath the baritone, and beneath that, a woman's contralto speaking numbers in bass 7, the numerical tongue of the Old Testament census. The reversed English surfaced less often, but when it came, it carried instructions: count the teeth of the living. Measure the shadow at midday. Mark the place where the last ember dies. They obeyed, because disobedience required a vocabulary of refusal they no longer possessed. The count was duly made, 97 teeth among the 21 remaining souls, an average that suggested either future loss or past bounty, no one could decide which. The shadow at midday was found to fall due north, though the sun stood south. This was recorded on a slate, and the slate was nailed to the meeting house door beside the silence decree, covering the nail hole left by the year. The last ember was preserved in a clay pot lined with moss, carried from hearth to hearth so that no single family would bear the burden of its extinction. Yet the pot cracked during the night, and the ember was discovered transformed into a single dried bean. Split along it seemed to reveal the miniature silhouette of the cove, complete with cabins and the white oak stump, all mapped in the bean's labyrinthine folds. They buried the bin beneath the manure pile, atop the bones of the secret hog, and within hours a shoot sprouted. Pale and hair-thin, that grew downward into the earth, root reversed, seeking darkness the way ordinary plants seek light. On the longest night of the year, the prayer-monger invited the cove to a final service. The invitation was not spoken but delivered by means of the shoot. Each household woke to find a single white root coiled on the doorstep, shaped into a noose that tightened when exposed to air. They understood. They dressed in their best remaining clothes, patched but clean, and walked to the prayer yard in procession, boots crunching on frozen fog. Hark awaited them beneath the oak, which now stood leafless but not bare. Every twig held a small object tied with thread, the crone girl's shift, the mule's second ear, crone's waxen bullet, the widow's wedding ring. The tree tinkled in the wind like a parody of Christmas. Between its roots, the earth had opened into a sinkhole the exact circumference of the stump, its walls lined with the same reversed writing that papered Hark's cabin. At the bottom lay the mirrored surface of water that reflected not the sky but the interior of the earth, a slow swirl of magma and fossil bone. He spoke to them in ordinary English at last, though the words arrived with the delay of thunder following distant lightning. He told them that the cove had been chosen, that every place possessed a throat through which its sins could be coughed up, and that the throat must be widened by degrees. He spoke of a ledger older than the stars, written in the language of unmaking, and of the necessity of paying what they prized above breath. Then he stepped aside, and the congregation saw that the stump had been hollowed into a pulpit, within which stood the preserved body of the mule, ears restored, eyes open and reflecting the same subterranean fire that glimmered in the sinkhole. The mule's mouth moved, and from it issued the voices of every soul who had ever attended the prayer yard, speaking backward in perfect unison. They heard themselves recanting baptisms, revoking wedding vows, unsinging lullabies. The sound was not loud, but it compressed the heart like a thumb pressed to a bruise. One by one, they were invited to descend. Not compelled, Hark never touched them, but invited, the way a well invites thirst. The first to step forward was Jedediah Crone, who had not spoken since firing at his dead wife. He climbed down the spiral of reverse writing, each footfall erasing the characters beneath it, and when he reached the water, he lay back without splash or ripple. The reflection closed over him like a mouth, and the stump refilled with earth, leaving no trace except the echo of his name spoken backward. The second was the boy who had lost his betrothed. He descended singing her name in reverse syllables, and the earth accepted him as docilely. One by one, they followed, until only 5 remained, the elder who had nailed the decree, the mother of the twins, a girl of 12 whose feet were already blue with frostbite, and 2 infants too young to walk. Hark regarded them with something that might have been pity, had pity itself not been exhausted. He told them they were the remnant, the seed corn of repentance, and that their task was to remember nothing. Then he too stepped into the sinkhole, still wearing his Eton hat, and the earth closed above him without seam. The 5 walked back to the settlement beneath a sky that had begun to lighten, though sunrise was still hours away. The fog had finally fallen, lying in sheets that tore about their ankles like burial linen. They found the cabins untouched, fires still banked, kettles still warm, but every mirror, those few that possessed one, was now a pane of polished slate on which their own faces appeared not in reflection but in profile, as though they were being observed from a place just behind their eyes. The white oak in the prayer yard had fallen, splitting the stump in 2, from the heartwood oozed a sap as clear and thick as glycerin, carrying in its bubbles the miniature scenes of those who had descended, forever descending, forever erased. They tasted the sap, it was sweet, with the aftertaste of iron, and felt their memories begin to loosen like teeth in aging gums. Years later, when surveyors pushed westward along a new turnpike, they found the cove uninhabited but peculiarly well tended. Cabins stood square, roofs intact, gardens planted with herbs that flowered out of season. In the meeting house, the single clock ticked though its hands had been removed. The silence decree still hung on the door, but the nail had rusted into a stain shaped like a reversed fingerprint. No bones were discovered, no graves, no trace of the sinkhole. Only the white oak remained, now leafless in perpetuity, every twig held a thread, but the objects tied there had become translucent, vibrating in the wind like the wings of insects that had forgotten how to fly. And beneath the tree, a child's shoe lay half buried in moss, scuffed at the toe, sized for a girl who would have been 17 by then, had time in the cove continued to measure itself in years. The surveyors took the shoe as a curiosity, but on the journey back, it crumbled into a fine yellow powder that smelled of scalded milk and gunpowder, leaving nothing to prove the place had ever existed, nothing except the taste of rust that lingered at the back of the tongue, and the occasional dream in which a voice speaks your name backward, softly, as if preparing the syllables for burial.